in the glittering heart of an imperial court, a silent maid is mocked for her ignorance, humiliated before nobles who never imagined she might understand more than any of them. But when a lost diplomatic scroll falls at her feet, she begins to read, not in one tongue, but in 9. Each word shatters their scorn, revealing a mind sharper than any blade and a past wrapped in secrets. What begins as ridicule becomes fascination, and a forbidden bond that neither crown nor custom can contain. Before we begin this beautiful period romance story, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing where you're joining me from. The smell of wet ash and boiled cabbage lingered in the vaulted kitchens of Schönbrunn Palace, rising with the steam that curled against the soot-darkened beams. It was barely past dawn, but already the hearths crackled with fire and iron pots sang with slow, bubbling discontent. Annika Löwen moved through the shifting fog of heat and damp, her thin linen sleeves rolled neatly to her elbows, her apron freshly tied and already smudged at the hem. She worked in silence as she always did, her presence so quiet it barely rustled the air. She knelt beside the copper pans, stacked like coins against the stone wall, and began scrubbing with rhythmic care. Her hands, reddened by lye and water, moved efficiently. She did not pause to speak or glance toward the knot of maids huddled by the ovens, whispering in voices too loud to be secret. Their eyes flicked to her now and again, speculative, mistrusting, but she gave them nothing to chew on. No gossip, no reply, not even a smile. They called her Ghost Girl behind her back, or worse, though never within reach of Frau Bärbel's ears. Frau Bärbel, bent and broad as a stove, was the only one who showed her kindness. This morning, the laundress shuffled in with her usual limp, muttering curses at a snapped clothesline and the wet sky above the courtyard. She stopped briefly beside Annika, squinting at her knuckles. "You've skinned yourself again, child." Annika shrugged, not out of defiance, but simple resignation. The injury didn't matter. The blood had stopped. Bärbel grunted and laid a square of clean linen beside her, a peace offering of sorts. "Use that to wrap it. You'll bleed into the pots." Annika gave a quiet nod and kept scrubbing. She preferred this. Movement, silence, purpose. The clang of iron against stone was a kind of language, one she understood, one no one could take from her. An hour later, as the kitchen settled into its daily chaos, a page in livery appeared in the archway, eyes scanning the room with haste and confusion. He held a waxed note and gestured toward the linen pile near the hearth. "You there," he said, pointing at Annika. "You're wanted in the grand hall." "To assist the court ladies." The sentence caused a ripple of silence. Annika paused, a cloth still in her hands. "She's no lady's maid," someone muttered. The boy squinted. "You're not with the linen detail?" Annika rose slowly, uncertain. Before she could answer, the head cook barked that she should go if summoned. She removed her apron, folded it with mechanical precision, and wiped her palms. The note bore the palace seal. It didn't matter if it was a mistake. Orders weren't questioned. The marble floors of the eastern wing echoed beneath her steps, each one swallowed in the vastness of the palace. She'd never entered the grand hall before, never needed to. Its doors loomed tall and gold-rimmed, manned by 2 guards in red and white livery. They opened the doors without looking at her, and she stepped into a sea of velvet, powdered wigs, and glinting chandeliers. The hall was colder than she expected. Daylight spilled from towering windows, illuminating long tables lined with ministers, foreign guests, and the powdered ladies of court. The air reeked faintly of perfume and ink. Every face was turned toward the dais, where the prince sat half-lounged across a velvet-cushioned chair, one booted ankle slung over a knee, his cravat carelessly knotted. He looked as if he'd been born bored. Annika clutched the folded linen she had brought by habit, her eyes fixed on the floor. Her presence caused a stir. The servants whispering from the sides, the ladies casting curious glances. She stood just inside the doorway, still and out of place, a grey shadow among silks and satins. Prince Lucas's gaze flicked toward her, disinterested at first, then amused. "And who might this vision of housekeeping excellence be?" he said lazily, his voice cutting through the murmurs. What's your name?" Annika bowed her head, remained silent. He waved a hand, beckoning to a court scribe seated nearby with a thick ledger. "Bring the linen register. She's been summoned, hasn't she? We must have a record. Let's ensure she signs for her glorious appearance." The scribe, his velvet coat stiff with embroidery, opened the book with deliberate flair. A quill was offered. Annika hesitated. Her fingers twitched around the cloth in her hand. "Come now," the prince said, smirking. "Don't tell me you can't write." A ripple of laughter passed through the room. Someone near the back said too loudly, "Perhaps she can draw a picture instead." Annika's pulse drummed in her ears. She didn't move. "Can she even spell her name?" the prince added, to louder amusement. Her throat tightened. If she spoke now, if she answered in the way she could, there would be no putting the secret back into the shadows. So she lowered her gaze and stepped back, hoping to disappear into the corner of the room. She would apologize to the steward later. She would endure whatever punishment followed. But fate, always cruel and unscripted, intervened. The tall double doors swung open with a loud creak. A court messenger burst through, red-faced and panting, tripped on the hem of a passing lady's gown, and stumbled forward. The scroll tucked under his arm flew loose, landing near Annika's boot. The man recovered himself, but the document, sealed and heavy, remained at her feet. "Pick it up and return it to someone who can read," the prince said with mock gravity. Laughter again. Annika did not laugh. She knelt, fingers brushing the cool marble as she lifted the scroll with both hands. Her palms were still raw from the morning scrubbing. She turned it gently, examining the seal. Her breath hitched. She stood. Slowly. A hush began to settle, uncertain. Her thumb pressed against the wax, and then she began to read. The words came low and fluid, spoken in Arabic, clear, unhesitant, formal. The scroll contained diplomatic language, rich in ceremonial titles and complex syntax, but she read as though it had been written in her own tongue. Murmurs ceased. Heads turned. The court grew still. She moved from Arabic into Latin, her cadence shifting effortlessly. Then into French, each syllable shaped with precise elegance, her voice quiet but commanding. She paused only once, to adjust her grip, then continued in Greek. The prince had not moved. His expression was no longer amused. In Hebrew now the scroll unfolded its message again, and she read it with reverence. Then Russian, slow, sharp consonants. Turkish, flowing like wind over stone. Italian, lyrical. And finally, Persian. The final phrase left her lips like a whisper, softer than breath. Silence fell like snow. She looked up. Prince Lucas rose from his chair, his expression unreadable, and said, "Where did you learn to do that?" For a moment, no one breathed. The prince's words hung in the air like the final note of a symphony, and the hush that followed was unnatural, too deep, too sudden, as though the very walls of the grand hall were listening. Annika stood in the center of it, hands still cradling the scroll, her breath shallow but even, her gaze steady. Then, chaos. A flurry of motion broke the silence. Courtiers murmured in disbelief, voices overlapping in panicked astonishment. One of the scribes stumbled forward, reaching for the document. A footman was sent sprinting to summon the foreign emissary who had arrived only that morning. Another disappeared down a side corridor in pursuit of the court translators. At the far end of the hall, the Count von Reichenau was already consulting with the chamberlain in a low, furious whisper. Prince Lucas had not moved. Still standing, he tilted his head slightly, studying Annika as though she were a painting that had come to life without permission. A servant. A kitchen maid. A girl who had just translated a classified draft in 9 languages with fluency none of his seasoned staff could muster. Annika remained where she was, surrounded by marble and whispers. Her fingers released the scroll only when a gray-haired scribe in formal livery gently took it from her hands. She gave no sign of triumph, no explanation, no fear. The foreign emissary, an Ottoman intermediary in heavy wool and gold brocade, arrived minutes later, his face flushed with urgency. He was quickly joined by 2 royal translators and the chief of court documents, a stooped man with small eyes and ink-stained cuffs. The emissary confirmed the authenticity of the seal, and the scribes, poring over the text with frantic energy, grew visibly pale as they read. "This is a working draft of a treaty," one of them said hoarsely. "Provisional terms for a trade passage through the Crimean Peninsula." No one in the room, save Annika, could read the entire document. In the hierarchy of the palace, such an anomaly had no precedent. It was not only irregular, it was dangerous. A common servant privy to the inner mechanics of imperial negotiation. A woman, unnamed and unranked, capable of understanding secrets, meant for heads of state. The court did not know whether to exalt her or arrest her. Prince Lucas looked down at the whispering tangle of nobles. Then he stepped from the dais. "Enough," he said, his voice low and commanding. The chamber obeyed. Silence reasserted itself, tinged now with something sharper than curiosity. "Escort her," he said to 2 nearby guards. "Gently. Take her to the receiving chamber in the east wing." Annika didn't resist when they approached her. She moved like a ghost through the parted crowd, the train of murmurs chasing her steps. The silk-clad court ladies stared as if she'd spoken blasphemy, as if fluency itself were sin. Lucas followed behind, his pace measured, joined by 2 men, Baron Wittgenstein, his lifelong tutor and advisor, and Herr Halden, the chief translator, still frowning deeply over the unfinished document. The prince said nothing as they made their way down the long gallery, past mirrors and pale tapestries, down a narrower corridor into a chamber lined with carved walnut and deep velvet. The guards stepped back. The doors shut. Annika stood alone at the center of the room, her back straight, her hands clasped loosely at her waist. She did not look around. She did not fidget. The only sound was the crackling of the fire in the stone hearth. Baron Wittgenstein stepped forward, adjusting his spectacles. "State your name," he said. His voice, though dry, was not unkind. "Annika Lowen." "Place of birth?" "Unknown." He frowned. "Unknown?" "I was left at the door of a chapel in Graz. I was told it was winter." She kept her eyes on the Baron, her voice quiet and even. "And who taught you to read? To speak in tongues?" "I was sent to a convent. The nuns taught me to copy. Later, a private scholar employed me as a scribe." "Name?" She hesitated. "He died." "No family?" "No." The Baron glanced at Lucas, who said nothing. Herr Halden stepped closer. "Your accent is local, but the pronunciation, particularly in Persian and Ottoman Turkish, it's not learned in a book. You've lived among speakers." "I copied for him," she replied simply. "He received many letters." "You were his secretary?" "I cleaned the lamps. I filled the ink. I copied what he marked." "Do you remember what you copied?" "Yes." Halden's brows rose. "All of it?" She said nothing. Baron Wittgenstein cleared his throat. "You understand the danger of what you've done. I was told to return the scroll to someone who could read it." The Baron almost smiled. "And why did you read it aloud?" Annika turned her head slightly. "Because I was told to return it." "Not to whom?" Herr Halden exhaled and turned away. The Baron's mouth twitched before he pressed his lips together. Then, softly but firmly, the Baron said something in Ottoman Turkish. A dense phrase, legal in nature, woven with formal terms of dispute and jurisdiction. He tilted his head expectantly. Annika answered. Her interpretation was clean, precise, and immediate. Prince Lucas, still silent, moved to stand across from her. His arms were folded. He didn't blink. His expression had lost its amusement. What remained was scrutiny, yes, but something quieter too, something that didn't entirely belong to judgment. Baron Wittgenstein gave a short, satisfied nod. She is not an ordinary servant. No, Lucas said finally. She's not. He looked at her then, not past her. His gaze was steady, searching. She looked back at him without flinching. We'll need time to investigate her background, the Baron said. And she can't remain among the kitchen staff. Lucas nodded once, slowly. Remove her from the servants' wing. She's to be housed near the Royal Library, under supervision. The guards shifted at the door. Lucas turned to them. She stays within palace walls. She is not to speak to anyone unless permitted. The fire crackled behind them. The velvet curtains stirred with a breeze from the flue. Annika didn't argue. She gave no thanks. But as the guards approached and placed a light hand on each of her arms, she lifted her head and did something she hadn't done all day. She looked at the prince. Their eyes met, and Lucas realized too late that hers were not filled with fear, but challenge. The room they gave her was narrow, tucked behind the eastern wing of the palace library, a windowless space once used to store parchment and wax tablets too fragile for daily use. Its stone walls were lined with high, empty shelving, and a single iron bed had been pushed against the far wall beneath an arched niche. A small table stood beside it, holding a clean pitcher of water, a candlestick, and a set of ink pots so old they smelled faintly of rust. Her clothing had been changed, the coarse gray gown and apron traded for a plain shift and bodice of unadorned blue wool, the kind worn by lower-rank scholars' assistants. No laces, no trim, no insignia, just fabric and function. The shift was too long in the sleeves and the bodice too loose. But Annika adjusted the fit with quiet hands, accustomed to making do. 2 guards were posted outside her door at all hours. They didn't speak to her. One of them, the younger of the 2, sometimes glanced her way when he thought she wasn't looking. The other kept his eyes on the corridor, his posture straight and unnervingly still. Neither had raised their voice. They hadn't needed to. The first night she did not sleep. Instead, she walked the perimeters of her small cell-like room, fingertips trailing along the cool mortar between stones. The library was silent at that hour, save for the shifting groan of beams above her and the faint scratch of mice in the rafters. A few candles had been left for her in a box beneath the desk. She lit one and sat down, unfolding the stiff paper left in a shallow drawer. A fresh quill, ink, a stack of unused folios. She could have written anything. She wrote nothing. The second night, she chose a book from the adjoining library, a copy of an ancient Greek translation of Persian folklore, bound in cracked red leather and misfiled behind a row of Hungarian maps. By morning, she'd read every line. On the third night, she selected a theological commentary written in Arabic and Latin in parallel columns, complete with interlinear glosses. By the 5th night, she was reading 3 books at once, one on grammar, one on trade routes through the Danube, and one with theological disputes scribbled in 6 alphabets. Herr Dran, the palace librarian, watched her from the shadows of his office. He said little, but she felt his gaze often. When he passed her reading desk, he did so slowly, letting the heel of his boots click against the tiles as a warning. He never asked what she was reading. He only made note of what she returned and how long it had taken. Each evening she worked through a new manuscript, and each day 1 or 2 men came to question her. Men who spoke with the polite edge of authority, some in military uniform, others in long robes ink-stained at the cuffs. They asked about her birth, her teachers, her time at the convent. She repeated what she had told the Baron, that she was orphaned, that she had copied manuscripts, that she had no family. When asked again, she gave the same answers with the same quiet voice. After the 3rd round of questioning, they stopped asking. The guards never changed. Herr Dran never smiled. The library became both sanctuary and prison. Some days, she almost forgot what fresh air felt like. Prince Lucas did not appear immediately, not in body, at least. But his presence crept in before he did. A tension in the room, a flicker of awareness that settled over her like a breath on the back of her neck. It began with murmurs, voices near the shelves, papers being shuffled too carefully. Then came the scent of bay leaf and clove, the faint signature of his cologne, and the distant sound of his boots walking the marble floor. He did not come near her desk. He chose the one across the aisle, angled just far enough to allow a clear line of sight. He didn't speak, he only observed. She never looked at him, but she knew. The watching changed nothing, except that it changed everything. Herr Dran began slipping more sensitive documents into her assigned stack. Pieces of correspondence in mixed tongues, old treaties, a fragment of a letter with a partially erased date and a watermark that suggested a forgery. She read each one, made no notes, returned them silently. He reported what he observed. It was the librarian who informed Lucas, in an unsealed note, that she had corrected 2 errors in a diplomatic translation bound for the Spanish court. That she had noticed a false seal on a document supposedly issued by the Polish ambassador. That her notes, while brief, revealed a comprehension beyond even his own. The prince was not amused. He was fascinated. He found himself unable to sleep after fencing practice. Couldn't focus when his riding instructor issued commands. The noblewomen presented to him in parade, each more eager, more expensively powdered than the last, blurred into one another. He offered polite smiles. Empty compliments. But his mind returned again and again to the girl in the library with ink on her fingers and shadows in her eyes. How had she come here? What game was she playing? He returned to the library in the early hours, long after the main floor had cleared, and watched her as she read. She never acknowledged him. Not even when he passed near enough to hear the soft sound of her turning a page. Not even when the candlelight caught the arch of her cheekbone or the slope of her neck and made her seem less like a curiosity and more like a puzzle he needed to solve. Then one afternoon, Herr Dran approached her desk. His tone was mild, almost kind. "They are discussing moving you," he said. She paused. "To a convent outside the city," he added. "For your protection. It may be more suitable." She said nothing, but her fingers curled, slowly, around the edge of the parchment she had been copying. She didn't tear it, didn't speak, but the tension in her hand was unmistakable. That night, long after the others had gone, she chose a specific volume from the library shelf. It was a disputed treaty between the Polish and Habsburg courts, partially translated, heavily annotated. She copied a passage from the margin, and beneath it wrote a note in 6 languages, carefully selected, intentionally layered. The last line she saved for Latin alone. Then she slid the paper between 2 pages, just visible enough to be found, and replaced the volume on the shelf where she knew the prince would be sent for review. She returned to her room. Slept, finally. The next morning, the treaty was delivered to Lucas with the rest of his correspondence. He unfolded it mechanically, skimming the terms, until the loose page slipped free and landed across his desk. At first, he thought it was an annotation. Then he read the first line, in French, the second, in Greek, then Arabic, then Hebrew, then Italian, then German. Each sentence delivered a single thought, a statement of position, of independence, a silent message dressed as translation. The final line, in Latin, was unmistakably addressed to him. "I am not the only one in this palace who wears a mask." He stared at the paper for a long moment. Then he set the note down and realized someone else had already read it before him. The morning air was sharp with frost. Pale light spilled across the eastern terrace of Schönbrunn Palace, catching on the iron railings and leafless vines that curled up the stone columns like skeletal fingers. Prince Lucas, still in his riding boots, had been preparing for a meeting with the naval minister when a servant arrived with a summons from his mother. He knew what that tone meant. The Archduchess never requested. She summoned, with precise timing and colder grace than any diplomat. Archduchess Helena received him in her private solar, where the windows were always shut too tightly and the fire burned with a contained fury that suited her nature. She sat by the hearth in a gown of dark emerald velvet, her hair coiffed into a net of pearls and jet. Her lips painted the faintest shade of crimson. She did not rise when he entered. Her expression was composed, and that, more than anything, put him on edge. "Close the door," she said, without turning. He obeyed. "I assume you've heard the latest." She picked up a fan from the side table and flicked it open with a snap. "Or perhaps you've been too preoccupied to notice the murmurs threading through the palace." Lucas crossed the room slowly. "If this is about the naval contracts there—" "It's about the girl," she said, the fan pausing mid-sweep. He didn't answer. "The one housed in the library wing." Her gaze lifted. "The one you've been visiting each day under the pretense of reviewing Ottoman border treaties." Lucas studied her. "And what exactly have the whispers been saying?" "That you're watching her." The Archduchess's mouth curved, though there was no warmth in it. "That you're intrigued. That perhaps your tastes lean more toward ink-stained commoners than daughters of noble blood." She rose then, walking to the mantel. Her presence filled the room like perfume too richly applied, beautiful, but suffocating. "I warned you, Lucas. Curiosity is a dangerous indulgence for a man in your position, especially when directed at a woman with no name, no patron, and no past." "She has a past," he said. Helena arched a brow. "I'm sure she does. The problem, my dear, is whose." Before he could respond, a rustle of skirts signaled a new arrival. The maid at the door announced Countess Irmgard von Aachen, then vanished before either of them could protest. The Countess swept into the room like a woman born to it. Her gown was the color of ink, cut in the latest Viennese fashion, with lace at the throat and sapphires at her ears. She curtsied, her movements polished and measured. "Your Highness." Her smile tilted toward Helena. "You asked for me." Lucas's shoulders tensed. Helena gestured for Irmgard to sit, then resumed her own place. "Irmgard and I were discussing the importance of suitable alliances. I thought you might benefit from her insight." Irmgard turned her gaze toward him with perfect calm. "Your mother fears you may be, how shall we say, entertaining yourself with enigmas." "I didn't realize the court had turned to riddles for gossip," Lucas replied dryly. "They always do when left to fill silence," Irmgard said. "And you've given them quite the silence to study." Helena's fan resumed its quiet sweep. "Irmgard comes from one of the oldest Tyrolean lines. She's educated, poised, and, most importantly, loyal. And conveniently available," Lucas added. Irmgard didn't flinch. "Let me be plain, Highness. I don't take offense, but I do take interest." She leaned forward, voice softening. "The girl in the library. She may speak in tongues, but that doesn't make her wise. It makes her dangerous. She hasn't harmed anyone." "Not yet," Irmgard said, her smile sharp. "Men fall in love with riddles when they're too cowardly to seek truth. You're not a coward, are you?" Lucas's jaw tightened. Helena waved a hand, tired of the game. "We only ask you to be cautious. The palace is not a place for sentiment." When Lucas left the room, he did so without another word. The corridors felt colder as he moved through them, light sliding like water across the marble floors. His steps led him back to the library, where the air still smelled faintly of wax and dust and candle smoke. He found Herr Dran behind his desk, sorting through a new delivery of court records. "I need to see the treaty you gave me yesterday," Lucas said without greeting. "The Polish Habsburg volume?" "Yes, the one with the note." Herr Dran paused. "I assumed you already had." "I did." Lucas's gaze narrowed, but someone else saw it first. The librarian's fingers hovered over the parchment. "How do you know?" "The edge of the page had been creased," Lucas said. "Folded and smoothed again." "I didn't fold it." Dran didn't answer. "Tell me who touched it." The librarian adjusted his spectacles. It was removed from the shelf briefly the night before last. Not by me. Who? There was a long silence. Finally, Dran said, "The man who requested it no longer holds access to this wing. He once had royal patronage, years ago, before the scandal." What scandal? He disappeared. Or was made to disappear. There are differing accounts. Lucas crossed his arms. A name. Dran's voice dropped. Matthias Fane. The name landed like a bell's chime in a silent cathedral. Lucas had heard it only once before, a decade ago, during a court dinner. A man known for his mastery of language, for tutoring foreign emissaries, and collecting secrets with ink-stained fingers. A man who vanished suddenly, without charges, but never returned. He left the library without another word, heart pounding beneath his waistcoat. Over the next hours, Lucas scoured what records he could find. Court memoranda, archived letters, abandoned correspondences. The story emerged slowly, like parchment held to flame. Matthias Fane had taken in a girl, an orphan, unrecorded, unclaimed. She had lived with him in shadowed quarters, copied his correspondence, learned his craft. There were references to her as a ghost scribe, a girl fluent in silence, used to pass messages between embassies. There were rumors she had been hidden under false names in noble households. That she vanished not long after Fen did. Lucas closed the last folder, his hands cold despite the fire beside him. If Annika was that girl, her presence at court was no accident. That evening, as dusk spilled over the palace gardens, Annika received a summons. She was to report to the conservatory, to assist in the review of translated Russian trade records. The order came from a steward, formally issued, stamped in wax. She obeyed. The conservatory, empty at that hour, echoed with the soft rustle of leaves and the low creak of glass panes shifting in the wind. Rows of potted citrus trees stretched along the tiled floor, their branches heavy with green fruit. At the center table, beside a ledger and an untouched carafe of wine, sat Countess Irmgard. She stood as Annika entered. Her smile was warm. Too warm. "Please," Irmgard said. "Sit." Annika approached, slow and wary. She sat, her hands folded in her lap. "There are no trade records," Irmgard said, voice light. "Only an opportunity." Annika said nothing. "I thought we might speak privately. No guards, no titles, just truth." Still no reply. Irmgard leaned closer. "You should ask to be sent away." Annika's brow tightened, only slightly. "There are documents," Irmgard said softly. "Proof of the things you've hidden, the places you've been. Do you remember why you left your last post?" Annika's hands clenched faintly in her lap. "I do," the Countess whispered. "And so will everyone else, if you stay." She reached into her sleeve and withdrew a sealed envelope, heavy cream-colored paper, a deep red wax seal, unmarked by symbol. "I suggest you open this when you're alone." Irmgard slid it across the table. "It may help you decide." Annika did not move. Irmgard stood. "You're not the only one who can read between lines, my dear." She left the conservatory in silence. Annika rose, slowly, and took the envelope with her. Outside the corridor, Lucas stood just beyond the shadow of the archway. He saw her emerge, saw the envelope in her hand. Their eyes met for a moment. She did not speak. She walked past him as if he weren't there. That night, in the flickering light of a single taper, Annika broke the wax seal and gasped at what she saw. The paper inside the envelope crackled like dry leaves as Annika unfolded it. The seal, once broken, had left a shallow red wax ring on the vellum, like blood smeared on silk. At first glance, it appeared like any other letter, orderly, formal, composed in a narrow official hand. But the signature at the bottom wasn't what drew her breath away. It was the script in the middle. The unmistakable curve of her own handwriting. The ink had faded, but not enough to hide what it was. A letter she had once copied, word for word as instructed. Nothing more, nothing less. She had been told it was diplomatic correspondence, routine, unremarkable. But this was no harmless message. It was a secret communiqué between two Austrian ministers, men of high office, and an exiled Russian noble. The content was veiled, shrouded in code, but the intent was clear to anyone trained to read beneath the surface. In exchange for gold, the Russian had promised intelligence, possibly names, possibly troop movements, perhaps even something darker. Annika had copied it, under order in a safe house outside Pressburg, never told the origin, never shown the destination. She had assumed it was destroyed. Now, here it was, in Irmgard's hands, a dagger, sheathed in cream paper, and passed to her like a whisper with teeth. Annika sat back on the narrow bed, her pulse drumming in her ears. She read it twice, 3 times. The letter bore her writing, unmistakably so, clean, efficient strokes, the way she had been trained. She hadn't signed it, but that hardly mattered. Anyone who had ever seen her hand would know. That alone was enough to unravel her, to ruin her. Treason by association. She folded the paper with mechanical care and stood. The room was dark except for the wavering glow of a single taper. Her breath left small clouds in the cold air. Moving to the far corner of the chamber, she knelt and pried at the loose floorboard beneath her desk, the one she had found her first night, warped from damp and just shallow enough to conceal what no one should find. She laid the letter inside, then replaced the board with slow precision. Only when the seam had disappeared into shadow did she rise. She smoothed her hands down the sides of her skirt and stepped back into the light. The work would help. It always did. She crossed to the table, pulled her current manuscript toward her, a Hungarian church charter with marginalia in Polish and Latin, and dipped her quill. The ink pooled at the tip. She began to write. Each stroke was steady, measured. She copied each line with perfect accuracy, translating as she went, word by word. But she no longer heard the words. Her mind had quieted to something colder than fear. The only sound was the scratch of the quill and the faint hiss of the dying candle. Elsewhere, far beyond the library wing, Lucas rode through the muddy countryside with winter wind tearing at his cloak. The sky above Vienna had dulled to pewter, and the hills that bordered the outer district rose like buried bones through a skin of frost. His destination lay hidden among them. A monastery long since decommissioned from public service, now housing men who had chosen silence, or had it forced upon them. He arrived at dusk. The iron gates creaked as they opened. The halls inside were dim and austere, the stones still holding the chill of centuries. A young monk led him through an inner corridor and gestured to a door at the end. "Father Mathieu will speak with you," he said. Lucas entered without hesitation. The man waiting inside was seated at a desk beside a hearth with low coals. His robes were dark and worn thin, his frame bent from years of confinement, and his hair, what little was left, hung in tufts around his ears. His eyes, however, were sharp, not dimmed by age or illness, but dark with memory. He looked up, not surprised. "You are the prince," he said in German. "I am." "Then you already know who I am." "I know what you were," Lucas said carefully. "Jesuit, scholar, diplomatic advisor to the Polish court, and the last man to teach a girl named Annika Lowen." Mathieu's mouth twisted. "She was not named Lowen when I knew her. But you knew her. I raised her." There was silence between them for a moment. Then the priest added, "And I failed to protect her." Lucas took a step forward. "What happened?" Mathieu leaned forward, his hands clasped. "She came to me with nothing. Not a language, not a name. Only silence. She listened before she ever spoke. I trained her because she absorbed everything, not like a student, but like water sinking into stone. She was never meant to be seen, just to learn, to pass between rooms unnoticed, to write what others could not." And the letter? Mathieu's jaw tightened. There were many letters. This one, Lucas said, pulling the folded parchment from his coat, a duplicate copied for his journey. Bears her hand, a message between Austrian ministers and a Russian noble. Mathieu didn't reach for it. He didn't need to. She was made to copy it. She didn't know what it said. He looked up. But when she did, she ran. From whom? From everyone. Lucas's hand closed over the letter. She's not safe. No, Mathieu said. Not here. Not in court. She has a mind like a blade, Your Highness. But she's been taught never to show it. That is a wound, not a gift. You think you see her now, but you don't. You see only what she allows. Then what would you have me do? Send her away. Lucas didn't speak. Mathieu looked toward the fire. Because if you don't, this place will crush her. Not through cruelty, through refinement, through silks and secrets and half-spoken promises. It will grind her down until she becomes what she hates. The ride back to the palace was long. Lucas didn't notice the cold. By the time he returned, night had fallen. The palace glittered with its usual grandeur, the windows glowing like distant constellations, unaware of what shifted within. He made his way to the library alone. The guards at the entrance recognized him and opened the doors without a word. Inside, the library was still. The air smelled of spent wax and dusted vellum. Only one candle burned near the rear table, hers. He walked slowly down the aisle. The manuscript lay open, its margin notes half finished. The quill rested beside it, the ink beginning to dry. A single candle flickered its last inch of wax. He touched the edge of the page. Then he saw it. A single line, scrawled in the margin, written in Latin. Non omnes caviae ferro funt. Some cages are not made of iron. He stared at it for a long moment, the quiet pressing in around him like breath on his throat. Then slowly, he turned. Annika stood just behind him, her face pale, her eyes rimmed with the sheen of unshed tears, and a folded decision trembling in her hand. She stood in the doorway like a figure cut from the dark. The light of the single candle stretched long shadows behind her, brushing the stone floor of the library as if even the flame dared not touch her fully. Her face was pale, her features drawn tight, though the tremor in her breath had been forced back beneath a layer of cold control. She held the sealed letter in both hands, pressed between her palms like a prayer. Lucas looked up from the manuscript, the stillness of the room broken by the sound of her step as she crossed the threshold. She had not spoken a word, but he felt the shift immediately, the fracture in her composure, the silence that no longer offered safety but exposed its own vulnerability. Her chin was lifted, but her expression had lost its usual armor. She looked older than she had the day before, or perhaps it was that she'd shed the illusion of youth entirely. Annika, he said, barely above a whisper. She said nothing, only moved forward until she stood at the edge of his desk. The letter trembled slightly as she set it down beside the half-finished manuscript. Lucas caught the edge of it with 2 fingers, eyes flicking over the now familiar wax seal. He knew without opening it that it was the same paper Irmgard had threatened her with, the trap he had sensed but hadn't yet seen. He broke the seal carefully. As he read, the room seemed to contract. The fire in the hearth hissed behind him, and the silence between them stretched until it felt like a second heartbeat. The handwriting on the page was not hers, but he recognized hers immediately in the body of the letter, the clean, fluid strokes of a practiced scribe, each line too precise to be coincidence. His jaw tightened. It was not a condemnation, not directly. But in the hands of someone like Irmgard, it was more dangerous than any formal charge. He set the paper down slowly. She waited, Annika said, voice low, for the right moment, for me to speak, for you to watch. And then she placed this in my hands, knowing exactly what it meant. Lucas met her gaze. She won't stop. No, she said, folding her arms over her chest. She'll wait again. And next time, she won't hand me the warning first. He studied her. Her skin was paler than he'd ever seen it, her mouth pressed thin. But there was something else in her now, too, an edge that hadn't been there before. Her silence was no longer about protection. It was preparation. You can't stay, he said, more to himself than to her. I know. He stood slowly, the paper still in his hand. But I won't let you go. She blinked just once. You don't have a choice. He stepped around the desk, then stopped, as though the distance between them wasn't space, but something heavier. You'll be hunted the moment you leave this place. You'll have no protection, no name, no allies. Annika didn't move. It's no different than before. It is now, he said. She gave a soft, bitter breath of laughter. Why? Because you're watching? No, he replied. Because the court is. She looked down at the letter again. The ink shone faintly in the candlelight. I won't let her use you, Lucas said, and I won't allow you to be erased. Annika looked up. What are you offering? She asked. He exhaled. A bargain. Her eyes narrowed. You will remain here, under my protection, as a visiting translator, publicly sanctioned, officially appointed, temporarily attached to diplomatic affairs, he said, his voice measured. You'll assist in the revision of several treaties under review. No one will question it. You'll have access to the halls of court and status enough to keep Irmgard from moving against you. Annika's expression didn't shift, but her shoulders tensed beneath her modest gown. You want me to lie. I want you to survive. She studied him. And when it ends, then you decide. There was a long pause. Lucas waited. At last she said, I'll agree. He nodded once. But with one condition. Name it. No lies between us, she said. No false titles, no pretending I'm someone I'm not. Not to you. Lucas's throat tightened. He didn't smile. He only said, Done. The next morning arrived colder than the last. The sky hung low with snowless clouds, and a brittle wind swept through the courtyards. Inside the palace, warmth glowed from oil lamps and gold trim. The assembly chamber had been arranged for the diplomatic review, a formal display of protocol before the court, one carefully choreographed to demonstrate unity between crown and council. The great hall had filled quickly, the air thick with murmurs before the doors had even opened fully. Nobles in powdered wigs and fur-lined robes whispered behind gloved hands, each glance more pointed than the last. The foreign ministers stood in clusters near the windows, talking in clipped phrases. And above it all, seated on the raised dais, Lucas waited. Then the doors opened. 2 guards stepped forward, their polished boots striking the marble in unison. Between them walked Annika. She wore a gown of dark plum silk, unadorned save for a narrow black sash at her waist. No jewelry. No powder. Her hair had been braided and pinned back in the simplest of chignons, exposing the fine bones of her face and the quiet pride in her posture. The fabric moved around her legs like water. The room stilled. She walked the length of the hall with even, unhurried steps. The hush that followed her was unlike any other. No longer curiosity, but awe threaded with discomfort. At the far end, Irmgard stood beside a group of visiting dignitaries, her expression composed and unreadable. She did not speak. She did not need to. Annika reached the foot of the dais and turned. A steward stepped forward, offering her the first of the scrolls. She took it calmly, unrolling the aged parchment and scanning the ink. No hesitation. No misstep. When she began to read aloud, the room leaned in. Her voice was steady, clear, measured in cadence and pronunciation. She translated into French, then German, then Russian, each phrase delivered with perfect inflection. She never paused to search for meaning. She never stumbled. Lucas watched from above, his hands clasped lightly on his lap. Her presence beside him altered the air. It didn't matter that she wore no crown. She stood with the weight of purpose. The court did not yet know, but they knew now beyond doubt. As she finished reading the final passage aloud, the heavy doors at the back of the chamber creaked open. A tall figure entered, dressed in a long coat of dark green with fur-trimmed cuffs, the collar marked with a golden insignia of the Persian embassy. He removed his gloves as he approached, his footsteps slow but certain. When his eyes landed on Annika, he stopped, then bent into a formal bow. His voice, low and precise, carried through the chamber. "Anahita," he said, using a name no one in Vienna had ever heard. The sound of her name, Anahita, hung in the chamber like incense that refused to clear. It wasn't a name known to the palace. It wasn't a name that belonged to Vienna or to any register of the Habsburg court, but it landed with weight and purpose, and the moment the Persian envoy uttered it, the assembled nobles straightened like reeds caught in a sudden wind. Annika didn't move. Her spine remained perfectly upright, her shoulders squared, but her eyes flickered, just once. And in that single instant, Lucas saw it. The shift in her, like a ripple under still water. Recognition, fear, memory. The envoy bowed again, lower this time. "Anahita Azar," he said more formally, using the full name with smooth, practiced enunciation. "It honors me to find you alive." Murmurs surged in waves around the hall. Faces turned. Whispers bloomed behind fans and gloved hands. Lucas stood immediately, his voice cutting through the noise with practiced command. "That is enough," he said. "The proceedings are adjourned for the day." A court official stepped forward in confusion, but one look from Lucas silenced him. The prince's gaze never left Annika. "Clear the chamber." Within minutes, the room emptied in uneven clusters. Irmgard was among the last to leave, her smile small and unspoken as she passed by. The doors closed with a weighted thud. Alone now, Lucas stepped down from the dais. His coat swept behind him, his boots echoing over marble. He stopped in front of her. "Is it true?" he asked quietly. Annika's lips parted, then closed. She took a breath that seemed to cost her something. "Yes," she said. They didn't speak again until they were behind locked doors in his private receiving chamber, a room used for confidential negotiations and quiet punishments. Annika stood near the hearth, the sleeves of her court gown pushed up as if they had begun to suffocate her. She did not sit. Neither did he. "I need the truth," Lucas said. "All of it." She swallowed once. "Years ago," she began, "when I left Father Mathieu, I was given a new name, not forged, but borrowed. A contact smuggled me out of the empire and placed me with the Persian delegation in Constantinople. As a translator? As a scribe. Unofficial. Unnamed. How old were you?" 17. She stared into the fire. "They didn't ask questions. I copied correspondence, trade requests, letters from consulates, sometimes things with codes. I never opened them unless I had permission. But eventually, someone noticed." She paused. "There were rumors among the Austrian agents in the city that the delegation was harboring a girl who had vanished from imperial custody. When the threats reached the doorstep, I ran. I used another name. Again. And found my way back across the border with the help of someone who owed a favor. I've used 3 names since then." She looked at him fully. Annika Lowen was the last. Lucas was silent for a long moment. "You know what this means," he said at last. Her jaw tightened. "Yes. To them, it's espionage, whether you intended it or not. They won't care why you did it. I know. And I've shielded you. I made you visible, official. That wasn't your mistake." His hands curled against the edge of the chair behind him. "If they discover this, it won't be your ruin alone. If I'm seen as protecting a traitor." Her eyes darkened. "Then your crown falls with me." Neither of them spoke. Lucas turned away, jaw rigid. His chest rose slowly beneath the embroidery of his coat. Then he crossed to his desk and summoned a steward with a bell pull near the fireplace. "Have the Persian envoy detained for questioning," he said, politely. The steward bowed and left at once. When the door closed, Lucas faced her again. I'll order a private investigation. I want to know who told him your name and why he used it now. He didn't come here to exchange greetings. Annika stepped toward him. You think it was Irmgard? I'm sure of it. Annika shook her head slowly. She's not the only one who remembers me. Then I'll find out who else does. That night, Lucas sat alone in his study beneath a wash of lamplight, his cravat loosened. Diplomatic scrolls spread across the table before him like the ruins of a collapsed fortress. He had reviewed the same paragraph in a trade proposal 3 times, without absorbing a word. A knock interrupted his stillness. A servant entered, bowed, and placed a folded note on the desk before vanishing again. Lucas picked it up. The parchment was thick, expensive. The handwriting, precise, unmistakable. Irmgard, no seal, no signature, just 3 lines, written in an even, elegant hand. There are things we preserve because they serve us. Others we remove before they destroy us. You may choose which she is. There was no demand. Only the shape of one. Veiled. Remove Annika, or lose everything she threatened. He folded the paper and placed it into the fire. Elsewhere in the palace, in the scholars' wing, Annika received her own letter, delivered not by courier, but slipped beneath her door in the early hours. An invitation, a private gathering, an assembly of noble scholars, foreign emissaries, and members of court. She was invited to demonstrate her knowledge, to perform, to prove, to impress. It was a trap. But it was also the only chance she would ever have to do it on her terms. She laid the invitation on the table beside her bed. Her pulse beat behind her ears. If they wanted a display, they would have one. She dressed slowly, carefully, not in the dark plum of court colors, but in a simpler gown. Charcoal gray wool, high-necked and severe, a scholar's uniform in every line. She pinned her hair tightly, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and reached for the manuscript she had been translating for the past 3 nights. It was still incomplete. She would bring it anyway. A knock on her door startled her. A guard stood in the corridor, breathless. A theft has been reported, Fräulein. She stepped into the hall. A diplomatic file, he said. From the prince's desk. A treaty draft. Gone. She felt her breath catch. The guard hesitated, eyes flicking toward her garments. And someone was seen near his study, he added, wearing kitchen livery. Annika's old uniform. The fire had long gone cold in Lucas's study, though its ashes still smoldered faintly in the grate. The document was gone. The treaty in draft, handwritten and personally annotated by Lucas and Annika both, had vanished from the desk where it had been locked only hours earlier. The significance of its contents, provisions between Austria and the Ottoman Empire, laying groundwork for a mutual trade corridor, was enough to make its disappearance a matter of state. But it was the timing that twisted the knife deeper. The guards reported that someone in kitchen livery had been seen near the study, not by the door. Inside. The palace's surveillance was too practiced for such an error to go unnoticed, and yet no alarm had been raised. And now, in hushed corners of corridors and drawing rooms, suspicion gathered with surgical precision. All eyes turned toward the girl who had once worn that uniform. Annika. Though Lucas hadn't said it, hadn't allowed the accusation to be voiced aloud in any official way, she could feel it in every shift of glance, every clipped greeting. She had helped write the treaty. She had touched it, translated it, studied it intimately. Who else would know how valuable it was? Irmgard's circle whispered first. Then the whispers took root in the council's chambers. Before the midday sun had crested fully over the rooftops, the message had reached Lucas's own mother. Is she still under your protection? The gathering of scholars, meant to showcase Annika's brilliance, to solidify her position, suddenly loomed as a test of loyalty, of truth, of proof. In the prince's war chamber, Lucas stood at the long window, looking down into the courtyard where court scribes crossed with documents pressed to their chests. His jaw was tight, his hands braced against the frame. Behind him, a steward waited for instruction. "She insists on attending?" Lucas asked, not turning. "Yes, Your Highness." He nodded slowly. "Very well. Let her." That afternoon, the imperial orangery bloomed with a different sort of color. Once a winter retreat for the Habsburgs' collection of citrus trees and rare plants, it had been converted into a glass-walled hall warmed by underground furnaces. A soft golden light filtered in through the high-paned windows, casting reflections on the polished marble floor. The air was fragrant with lemon leaves and parchment, and every surface shimmered with quiet luxury. Long tables had been set with maps, folios, and manuscripts, some mounted behind glass, others laid open for scholarly display. An audience of ministers, foreign dignitaries, and noble scholars had already begun to gather. They spoke in refined tones, but their anticipation was palpable. Not all of them had come to see her succeed. Most had come to see her tested, and she would not disappoint. Annika entered alone. She wore a simple slate-gray gown, modest in cut, the ink stains at her cuffs unapologetically visible. Her hair was pinned back tightly. A leather satchel hung at her side. She did not glance left or right. She did not smile. She walked the center of the room, her boots silent against the floor, and stopped before the table where the first manuscript waited. Lucas watched from a quiet corner of the room, near a carved archway. His coat was black, unadorned, his cravat carelessly knotted. He did not move as she passed him, but his gaze did not leave her. The first test came in the form of a faded ecclesiastical scroll in Latin and Hebrew. The text, partially obscured by time and moisture, described the protocols of an ancient tribunal. She read both columns aloud, translating them fluently into formal High German, adjusting tone and cadence to reflect religious context. Her voice never faltered. The second was a political memorandum written in archaic French, scattered with Ottoman loanwords and coded signatures. She unraveled it in minutes, identifying the embedded names of minor officials from 2 decades earlier and clarifying the misdated royal seals with calm authority. The third was a Persian poem, philosophical, full of metaphor and layered piety. She recited it first in the original, then again in German, and once more in poetic French, altering rhythm and form with delicate control. Murmurs of approval began to replace the earlier silence. But Lucas saw what others did not. She was tired. Not physically. Her posture remained straight, her hands steady. But something beneath her composure trembled, an effort hidden, barely contained. She was holding herself together word by word, breath by breath. She was fighting for her place, for her name. And then the final test was brought forward. A steward approached the table and laid a single scroll in the center of the desk. Its seal was unmarked, new, too clean to be genuine. But the parchment, Lucas recognized it instantly. A copy of the stolen treaty. Annika looked down at it. Silence returned. She glanced once at Lucas, brief, unreadable. Then she began to read. The text was complex. Trade balances, boundary revisions, coastal access rights along the Adriatic, and a shipping clause that affected 3 disputed ports. She translated each phrase without hesitation, voice steady and clipped. A few ministers nodded approvingly. A visiting scholar from Krakow scribbled notes furiously in the margin of his journal. Then, midway through the 4th clause, Annika stopped. She blinked once, read again, and lifted her gaze to the room. "This line is incorrect," she said quietly, her voice clear. "The wording here implies Austria will retain exclusive rights over the northern Danube crossings." She placed a finger on the clause. But the original draft shared access equally with the Ottoman delegation, in accordance with the August correspondence. Whispers surged. A few heads turned. A man at the back of the room cleared his throat in disbelief. A diplomat from the Ottoman side leaned forward. "You are certain?" Annika nodded. This copy contains a mistranslation, not easily spotted. It shifts the power of enforcement from joint to unilateral, which would have granted Austria more than it was entitled to. She lifted her eyes. It is not an error. It is a forgery. A gasp. Then silence. How do you know? Someone demanded. Where is the original? Annika said nothing for a breath. Then she reached into her satchel. Her hand emerged holding a tightly rolled scroll, worn and aged, the seal intact and familiar, marked with the prince's own sigil. She stepped forward slowly and placed the real document, untouched, on the table before the astonished council. The scroll lay between them like a relic. The real treaty, the true document, untouched by alteration, its seal still intact with the faint curve of Lucas's own signet pressed into wax. It glinted beneath the orangery's filtered light, pale and unimposing, though it held more weight than anything else in the room. A low gasp moved through the gathered assembly, followed by a dozen murmured speculations. Annika straightened. Her gaze swept the room once, not defiant, but certain. She spoke calmly, the soft resonance of her voice cutting through the silence like a steady chisel through stone. I found the treaty in the library, she said. It had been mislaid among diplomatic transcriptions. I recognized it by the formatting. It bore the notation system His Highness and I used during review. No one interrupted her. She looked toward the senior minister at the center of the table. By the time I realized what it was, the theft had already been reported. If I returned it immediately, without explanation, I feared I would be accused of stealing it myself. And why present it now? The man asked. Because this is the only room, she said softly, where the truth could be seen by more than one pair of eyes. She let that settle. No accusations made behind closed doors, she added. No assumptions whispered through corridors, only evidence. There was a pause, brief but thunderous in its implication. The Ottoman envoy, seated beside the Hungarian attaché, inclined his head slowly. We accept this as the original, he said, his voice neutral but edged with caution. And we accept the girl's translation as correct. The clause in the copy is altered. She is not a girl, Lucas said, stepping forward at last. His voice was low but clear. She is the appointed translator of this court, and her word will be weighed accordingly. Annika looked down, but not in shame. She didn't speak again. It was Herr Dran who did. The palace librarian, silent until now, moved forward from the margin of the assembly. His hands were clasped behind his back, his spectacles catching the afternoon light. I can confirm her statement, he said. I saw her retrieve the document. She showed it to me in private, and I advised her to delay its return. Her judgment, however unorthodox, was correct. If it had passed through the wrong hands, the forgery would have been buried, and she would have taken the fall. And who forged it? Asked a counselor, turning. It took 2 days for the answer to surface. A junior aide to the treasurer's office, someone of little consequence in court, but not without connections, had been bribed into forging the altered clause. The source of the bribe was harder to confirm. But the young man, under questioning, admitted that he had taken instruction from someone in Countess Irmgard's inner household. No names, no written orders, just a suggestion and a purse of coin. It was enough. Lucas confronted Irmgard in the north gallery behind closed doors, where only the tapestry-woven walls could witness their words. She did not protest the accusation directly. She did not admit her guilt, but neither did she feign ignorance. Instead, she lifted her chin and replied in a tone as smooth as glass, "Influence is not always a crime. You'll find, Your Highness, that history prefers implication to confession." His answer was colder. And history forgets the names of those who are dismissed quietly. Within a week, the Countess had departed for the countryside under the pretense of attending to her family's estate. Her presence in court was not forbidden, but the privileges of her rank were quietly rescinded. No more council invitations, no more private audiences. Her name remained on the registry, but her power had vanished like perfume in wind. Annika, meanwhile, was summoned to a chamber she had never seen before, spare, well lit, and lined with shelves that reached to the ceiling. She stood before the Chancellor, Herr Albrecht, who informed her, without ceremony, that by royal decree and ministerial approval, she had been appointed court translator. Officially, irrevocably. She would be granted a stipend, a seal, and a position listed in the court records. A title, even if it wasn't noble. A role, even if it was still watched. She left the chamber in silence, her heart numb and heavy, not with fear, not with shame, with magnitude. A servant walked her back through the corridor leading to the library. Her boots made no sound on the rugs. The walls felt unfamiliar, as if she no longer belonged to the space that had shaped her survival. Lucas was not there when she returned, nor was he in the main reading room, or among the scattered tables she'd once scrubbed as a maid. She sat alone at the great oak desk in the corner of the library. She placed her new seal beside her inkwell. It bore no crest, only a single symbol, a feather and flame, crossed together. The court's mark of scholarship. It was not nobility, but it was power. The rumors burned through Vienna like kindling. A servant, now sanctioned. A prince, still unwed. A court divided in its opinions, but the official statement released by Lucas's office smoothed the scandal with strategic elegance. Mistress Annika Lowen, through diligence and intellect, has aided the Crown in correcting translation inconsistencies and preventing diplomatic missteps. Her appointment reflects the Empire's commitment to merit and the preservation of truth in negotiation. In private, however, the Crown still pressed Lucas to marry. Noble names were suggested. Portraits discreetly shown. Letters of inquiry from duchesses and barons trickled in with increasing frequency. He ignored them all, but the pressure was unrelenting. The Habsburg line demanded heirs, not sentiment. Politics didn't pause for personal devotion, and yet Lucas could not stop watching her. He no longer tried to hide it. He sat with her during translation sessions, listened to her speak the forgotten dialects of mountain villages and the formal cadences of imperial Persian, his eyes drawn not just to her mouth, but to the thoughts behind it. There were nights when they walked the narrow garden path behind the west wing, saying nothing, breathing the same cool air. He never touched her, never tried. But the silence between them pulsed with what neither dared name. For Annika, the struggle was no less sharp. She had her freedom now, hard-earned, delicate. She had her own chamber in the scholar's residence, a room with windows that opened onto the rose courtyard. She was known, respected, and yet she was not at peace. Her thoughts returned to him too often. She remembered his quiet defense in the orangery, the rage in his eyes when Irmgard was named, the note he once left folded inside a dictionary of Ottoman trade routes. I trust your voice more than I trust my own counsel. But he was a prince, and she was not. There was no space for her at his side in the eyes of the world. No law, no allowance, no future. Not in Vienna, not in 1784. The choice clawed at her each morning, build the life she had fought for, or risk everything to stand beside him. She packed her belongings in silence, just the essentials. A change of clothes, her seal, 2 folios of incomplete translations, and a single worn copy of Avicenna's Metaphysics that had once belonged to Father Mathieu. She left the library quarters in the early hours before dawn, crossing the east corridor alone. Her new residence was in the outer scholars' wing, closer to the university annex, with its own entrance, a garden, and full privacy. It was a promotion, a reward, a promise of selfhood. The key was already in her hand when she reached the door. She opened it slowly. The scent of fresh wood oil drifted toward her. The windows had been cleaned. A fire had been lit in the hearth. The desk near the window had been prepared with paper, ink, and an inkwell bearing the emblem of the prince's personal stationer. And resting in the center of the desk was a letter, folded, sealed with red wax, and stamped with the royal crest of Thurn. The letter was from Lucas, and it changed everything. The wax gave way with a quiet crack, the seal imprinting faint red flecks onto her thumb. Annika held the folded parchment in her hand for a moment longer, unmoving, though her breath no longer came evenly. Around her the chamber was still. Only the faint ticking of the wall clock and the pop of a single fire-warmed log broke the hush. She unfolded the letter. It was handwritten in a precise, unfussy script she knew too well. Not the elegant, court-trained calligraphy of dictated missives, but the raw, sure strokes of Lucas's own hand, letters slanting just enough to betray speed and restraint. Annika, I will not insult your intelligence with riddles or courtly phrases. You have heard enough of those. This is not from the Prince of Thurn. This is from me. I once thought you a curiosity, then a disruption, then a puzzle I couldn't resist solving. Now I know better. You are none of those things. You are real. You are the truest thing I have known inside these gilded walls. You have changed my world, not with speeches or schemes, but with silence, with ink, with truth. I cannot offer you what you deserve, not now, not in the way Vienna demands, nor in the way imperial law allows. I know the weight of the crown too well to promise what would burn us both. But I can offer you what is mine to give. I will not marry anyone else. Let them pressure. Let them parade noble names. I will not stand at the altar beside someone whose voice I do not hear in my sleep. Stay. Not as a translator, not as a servant, but as you are. Stay with me. Let this be what we make of it. We owe nothing to the court's gaze, only to what we choose between ourselves. You once wrote that some cages are not made of iron. I think some freedoms are not written into law. You are my freedom. L. Her hand trembled as she lowered the page. She didn't cry. But the quiet that swept over her was not stillness. It was thunder wrapped in silence. 1,000 thoughts rushed into the emptiness behind her ribs. Memories of convent stone, of cold fingers tracing borrowed letters, of standing humiliated beneath chandeliers, of ink-stained cuffs and mocking laughter. She had never dared want this. Not really. Not when survival had always demanded less. But now, in the flicker of one flame, in the simple words of a man too bound by crown to offer more, something broke loose. The fire popped softly. She folded the letter with care, pressing the edges together, as if sealing them again would calm her racing heart. Then she set it down, rose, and wrapped her shawl around her shoulders. She left the chamber without taking anything else. The palace slept around her. Stone hallways stretched long and bare, save for the torches burning in sconces spaced between tapestries. Her footsteps made no sound against the runner beneath her boots. She did not hurry. She moved as if drawn by instinct, not purpose. The walls of Schönbrunn had once felt endless to her, a maze of power and privilege she could only navigate from the shadows. Now, each turn in the corridor held meaning. She passed the eastern corridor where she'd once been caught with a letter she wasn't meant to hold. The alcove where Lucas had first followed her, silent and watching. The carved wooden door of the conservatory, where Irmgard had offered threats wrapped in courtesy. Each room, each step, told the story of who she had become. But it was in the grand hall she stopped. The marble floor gleamed beneath the moonlight, cold and pale. It was here he had mocked her. She saw it as if it were happening again. Lucas half lounging on his throne-like chair, the laughter from powdered courtiers spilling like wine, her face burning as they asked whether she could spell her own name. The weight of humiliation, the heat of restraint, and the scroll rolling toward her boot like an accident, like fate dressed in bureaucracy. She remembered the hush when she began to read, the astonishment, the prince rising. Where did you learn to do that? She turned from the memory and continued on. The sky had begun to lighten when she reached the private gallery that overlooked the chapel courtyard. A soft amber glow touched the horizon beyond the glass, kissing the domes with the first trace of dawn. He was there. He stood by the window, still in his formal coat from the day before, the collar loosened, the buttons near his throat unfastened. His hands were clasped behind his back, and though he did not move at the sound of the door, she knew he had heard her enter. She closed the door behind her. For a moment nothing passed between them, no words, no motion. Then he turned. The quiet in his eyes nearly undid her. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. She stepped forward, and into his arms. He held her without urgency, without heat, without anything but the certainty of a man who had waited and would continue to wait, regardless of the hour or the outcome. No oath, no promise, no titles. Just the shape of her against him, and the space she chose to fill. Weeks passed, and the palace adapted in the only way courts knew how, through silence, speculation, and unacknowledged acceptance. Annika remained in the scholars' wing, but her presence in courtrooms became routine. She stood beside Lucas during treaty readings. She reviewed drafts in the War Office. She walked the garden paths with him during dusk, a book in one hand, his sleeve grazing hers when the wind caught her balance. They were never seen touching, but they were never far apart. The Empress Dowager said nothing publicly, though her chamberlain made careful inquiries. Lucas remained firm. He refused to entertain suitors, declined dinners, ignored gifts. He said little, but his silence spoke. Annika returned to the library with unrestricted access. She reorganized archives, corrected misfiled documents, added marginalia that later ministers would mistake for royal scribes' annotations. She wore plain gowns, pinned her hair simply, and always kept ink stains on her cuffs. The ministers grumbled, but offered no open resistance. Her appointment could not be revoked without raising more scandal, and Lucas's unwavering defense made any attack unwise. In public, she was a scholar. In private, she was his. They never spoke of marriage, not because they feared it, but because it was a word that did not belong in the language they had crafted together, one of quiet glances, of pages slid between desks, of sentences begun and finished in different tongues. Once, as she passed a window where frost had begun to form on the glass, she caught sight of their reflection, her head slightly tilted, his shoulder angled toward hers, and thought it strange how obvious love looked when stripped of all its costumes. In the language they shared, nothing more needed to be said. It was already complete. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. What did you think of the story? Was there a moment that truly captured your heart, or a scene you didn't expect? I'd love to know what stood out to you the most. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. I always enjoy reading what you have to say. Your feedback means a lot and helps the story reach even more readers. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.